the first-class cabin of Flight 392. From Chicago's O'Hare International Airport to Los Angeles hummed with the soft purr of the Boeing 787 Dreamliner's engines warming up on the tarmac. The golden glow of the setting sun poured through the oval windows, casting a warm amber sheen across the polished wood paneling and plush leather seats. The faint clink of champagne flutes mingled with the low murmur of polite conversation, creating an atmosphere of refined tranquility. Passengers adjusted their cashmere scarves and flipped through glossy magazines, their designer luggage neatly stowed overhead. For Lila Davis, seated in 2A, this moment was a rare oasis of fleeting reward for years of relentless battles in and out of the courtroom. Lila, a 34-year-old environmental lawyer and activist, leaned back in her seat, her fingers brushing the smooth navy fabric of her tailored blazer. Her window seat, reserved weeks in advance, offered a perfect view of the bustling tarmac, where baggage carts zipped like fireflies against the fading light. She exhaled deeply, savoring the crisp scent of the cabin air, tinged with notes of fresh coffee and the subtle musk of expensive cologne. On her lap rested a worn leather tablet case, its edges frayed from years of accompanying her through late-night strategy sessions and high-stakes depositions. Just 3 days ago, Lila had stood in a Chicago courtroom, her voice steady as she delivered the closing argument in a landmark case against a corporate giant polluting the South Side's water supply. The victory had been monumental, cleaner water for thousands of families, a front-page story in the Chicago Tribune, and a ripple of hope for communities long ignored. But it had come at a cost: months of sleepless nights, hostile threats from corporate lawyers, and the constant weight of proving she belonged in rooms where she was often the only black woman. This flight to Los Angeles was supposed to be a reset. Lila's parents and younger sister, Nia, were waiting for her in their modest Inglewood home, where the smell of her mom's cornbread and the sound of Nia's laughter would ground her again. She adjusted the silk scarf around her neck, its soft teal fabric a gift from her mother after her first big case win. Reaching into her tablet case, she pulled out a small notebook, its pages filled with handwritten notes for her next project, a community-led initiative to monitor industrial emissions. The pen in her hand felt like an extension of her will, each word a step toward justice. She glanced out the window, the horizon now a blend of fiery orange and deepening purple, and allowed herself a small smile. This seat, this moment, was hers. But moments of peace, as Lila would soon learn, could be as fragile as the glass of sparkling water a flight attendant placed on her tray table. A sharp voice sliced through the cabin's calm, jarring Lila from her thoughts. "Excuse me, there's been a mistake." The words carried the clipped precision of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Lila looked up, her gaze landing on a man striding into the first-class section, his polished loafers clicking against the cabin floor. He was in his early 50s, tall and broad-shouldered, with a shock of silver hair swept back from a tan forehead. His tailored charcoal suit screamed wealth, as did the heavy gold watch glinting on his wrist. Behind him trailed a younger woman, her blonde hair pulled into a tight bun, clutching an oversized designer tote. The man's posture radiated entitlement, his chin tilted upward, as if the world existed solely to serve him. His companion, clearly an assistant, hovered nervously, her eyes darting around the cabin. Lila's instincts prickled. She'd seen men like him before, boardroom titans who wielded their privilege like a weapon, assuming everyone else was a step below. She returned her attention to her notebook, unwilling to engage, but the man's voice grew louder, now directed at a flight attendant who hurried toward him. "This is unacceptable," he said, gesturing vaguely toward Lila's row. "I'm a Diamond Elite member. I always get the window seat into A. There's clearly been a mix-up." The flight attendant, a young man with neatly combed brown hair and a name tag reading Jason, offered a practiced smile. "Let me check." "Sir, what's your name?" "Bradley Thornton," the man replied, his tone dripping with impatience. "Thornton Properties, you've probably heard of me. I own half the skyline in Chicago." He waved a hand dismissively, as if the details were beneath him. His assistant, standing a step behind, nodded vigorously, though her expression betrayed a hint of unease. Lila's fingers tightened around her pen, but she kept her eyes on her notebook. She knew where this was going. Bradley Thornton's name did ring a bell. His real estate empire had been in the news, often tied to controversial developments that displaced low-income families. She'd crossed paths with his kind in courtrooms and community meetings, men who saw her skin color before her credentials, who assumed her presence in spaces like this was a fluke. Still, she stayed silent, hoping the situation would resolve itself. Jason tapped at his tablet, his smile faltering. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thornton, but Seat 2A is assigned to Ms. Lila Davis. She booked it in advance, and there's no error in the system." He glanced at Lila, his tone polite, but tinged with hesitation, as if he sensed the storm brewing. Bradley's sharp blue eyes snapped to Lila, narrowing as they took her in her poised posture, her blazer, the notebook on her lap. His lips curled into a faint, condescending smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ms. Davis, is it?" he said, his voice carrying a patronizing edge. "I'm sure you'd be more comfortable in another seat. This one's meant for someone, well, let's just say it's my usual spot." He gestured toward her seat as if it were already his gold watch catching the cabin's light. Lila looked up, meeting his gaze with a calm intensity that seemed to catch him off guard. Her voice was steady, each word measured. "This is my seat, Murdoch Thornton. I reserved it, I paid for it, and I'm staying right here." The cabin fell silent, the other passengers' conversations fading as they sensed the tension. A woman in a silk blouse across the aisle glanced over her magazine, her eyes flicking between Lila and Bradley. A businessman in a pinstripe suit pretended to focus on his laptop, but his fingers hovered over the keyboard, betraying his curiosity. Bradley's assistant, who had introduced herself as Claire Evans, shifted uncomfortably, clutching her tote bag tighter. Bradley's smile vanished, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "Look, I don't think you understand," he said, his voice lowering but growing sharper. "I'm a Diamond Elite member. That means I get priority, always. I'm sure the airline can find you another seat, maybe in business class." His tone implied that business class was a generous concession, a place where someone like Lila belonged. Lila arched an eyebrow, her expression unshaken. "I understand perfectly," she replied, her voice smooth but firm. "And I'm still not moving." Claire leaned toward Bradley, whispering something inaudible, but he waved her off with a sharp gesture. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, loud enough for the cabin to hear. "Do you know how much I spend with this airline every year? More than most people make in a decade." He turned back to Jason, his voice rising. "Get me the supervisor." Now, Jason hesitated, his eyes darting to Lila, who remained serene, her pen poised over her notebook as if the confrontation were a minor distraction. "Yes, sir," he said finally, his voice tight. He pressed a button on his headset and spoke in a low tone, summoning the flight supervisor. The cabin's atmosphere thickened, the air heavy with unspoken judgments. Lila could feel the weight of the other passengers' stares, some curious, some judgmental. But she'd been here before, in courtrooms, in boardrooms, in every space where she'd had to prove her right to exist. This was just another test. As Jason stepped away, Bradley crossed his arms, his watch glinting under the cabin lights. "You could make this easier, you know," he said to Lila, his tone dripping with condescension. "It's just a seat. No need to make a scene." Lila closed her notebook with a deliberate thud, her eyes locking onto his. "I'm not the one making a scene, Mr. Thornton," she said, her voice low but carrying the weight of a gavel. "You're the one trying to take something that doesn't belong to you, and I suggest you stop before you embarrass yourself further." Bradley's jaw tightened, his face flushing a faint red. For a moment, he seemed at a loss for words, unaccustomed to being challenged so directly. Claire tugged at his sleeve, her voice a nervous whisper. "Bradley, maybe we should just—" "Quiet," he snapped, cutting her off. His eyes never left Lila, his gaze now a mix of anger and disbelief. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," he said, his voice low and menacing. "I always get what I want." Lila tilted her head slightly, a faint smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Not today," she said simply, her words slicing through the tension like a blade. She reopened her notebook, her movements deliberate, as if dismissing him entirely. The cabin door hissed open, and a woman in a crisp Navy uniform stepped into the first-class section. Her name tag read Sarah Mitchell, flight supervisor, and her expression was one of practiced neutrality, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. She approached the row, her heels clicking softly against the cabin floor. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her voice calm but authoritative, her gaze shifting between Lila and Bradley. Bradley jumped in before Lila could respond, his voice loud and indignant. "Yes, there's a problem. This woman is in my seat. I'm a Diamond Elite member, and I expect this to be fixed immediately." He gestured toward Lila as if she were an inconvenience to be removed. Sarah turned to Lila, her expression softening slightly. "Mum, may I see your boarding pass, please?" Lila handed over the pass without a word, her movements smooth and unhurried. Sarah examined it, her brow furrowing as she cross-checked it with her tablet. "Everything checks out," she said, her tone professional but cautious. "Ms. Davis, this is indeed your seat." Bradley's face darkened. "That's impossible," he snapped. "Do you know who I am? I don't sit in aisle seats. I don't sit anywhere but to A. Fix this, or I'll be speaking to your CEO." Sarah hesitated, her eyes flicking to Lila, who sat calmly, her notebook open again. Her pen poised, the supervisor's hesitation spoke volumes. She knew Bradley's status carried weight, but she also knew Lila was within her rights. The cabin watched in silence, the tension palpable. As Sarah weighed her options, "Ms. Davis," Sarah began, her voice careful, "I understand this is your seat, but to resolve this quickly, would you consider moving to another first-class seat? Perhaps 3A. It's still by the window." Lila looked up, her gaze steady and unyielding. "No," she said simply, her voice cutting through the cabin like a quiet thunderclap. "I booked this seat for a reason, and I'm not moving to accommodate someone who thinks they're more important than me." Bradley let out a sharp laugh, his voice dripping with disdain. "Unbelievable. You're really going to make this difficult. People like you always do." His words hung in the air, heavy with implication, and several passengers shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting away. Lila's expression didn't waver, but her eyes sharpened, locking onto Bradley's with an intensity that made him flinch. "People like me," she repeated softly, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of years of unspoken battles. "Care to clarify what you mean by that?" The cabin held its breath, the silence deafening. Bradley opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Lila reached for her phone, her movements deliberate. She typed a quick message, her fingers steady, her face unreadable. The faint chime of the phone confirmed the message had been sent. She set it back on her tray table and returned to her notebook, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to Bradley's growing agitation. Sarah cleared her throat, her voice strained. "Let's all stay calm," she said, glancing between the two. "Mr. Thornton, please take your assigned seat for now, and we'll sort this out." Bradley's face twisted in fury. "This isn't over," he hissed, glaring at Lila as if she were the source of all his problems. He stormed toward his seat in B, muttering under his breath about entitled nobodies and incompetent staff. Claire followed, her face pale, her tote bag clutched tightly against her chest. As Sarah retreated to the galley, Jason lingered, his eyes meeting Lila's for a brief moment. "I'm sorry about this," he said quietly, his voice tinged with guilt. Lila nodded, her expression softening slightly, but offering no further comment. She knew this was far from over, and deep down, she was ready for whatever came next. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky now deep indigo. The engines roared to life, signaling the plane's imminent departure. But in the first-class cabin, a different kind of storm was brewing, one that would test the limits of privilege, power, and justice. Lila Davis, with her quiet strength and unyielding resolve, was at its center, and she had no intention of backing down. The first-class cabin of Flight 392 sat steeped in an uneasy hush, the golden glow of the setting sun now fading into a soft indigo twilight outside the oval windows. The hum of the Boeing 787's engines was a steady undercurrent, but it did little to mask the tension that hung heavy in the air. Passengers, their champagne flutes untouched and magazines forgotten, stole glances at the unfolding drama in row 2. Lila Davis biblical verses adorned the leather armrests, their whispered conversations barely audible over the faint clink of ice in crystal glasses. At the center of it all sat Lila Davis, her posture composed and seat to a. Her navy blazer crisp against the plush leather. Her worn leather tablet case rested on her lap, a silent testament to her years of battling injustice. Across from her, into B, Bradley Thornton simmered, his silver hair catching the cabin's soft lighting as he crossed his arms, his gold Rolex glinting with every impatient tap of his fingers. The confrontation over Lila's window seat had left a palpable rift in the cabin, and though Bradley had retreated to his assigned seat, his indignation radiated like heat from a furnace. Lila, a 34-year-old environmental lawyer and activist, kept her eyes on her notebook, her pen moving with deliberate precision across the page, her handwritten notes strategies for a new community-led initiative to monitor industrial emissions were a lifeline, grounding her in purpose amid the storm brewing around her. Just 3 days ago, she'd stood in a Chicago courtroom, her voice steady as she secured a landmark victory against a corporate giant, polluting the South Side's water supply. The win had been a beacon of hope for thousands of families, but it had come at a cost: months of sleepless nights, veiled threats, and the constant need to prove her place in spaces where she was often the only black woman. This flight to Los Angeles, to visit her family in Inglewood, was meant to be a moment of respite, but Bradley Thornton's attempt to claim her seat had shattered that illusion, exposing the same entitlement she'd fought against her entire career. Bradley's sharp voice still echoed in her mind. "This seat's meant for someone, well, let's just say it's my usual spot." The words, laced with condescension, had been a thinly veiled jab at her presence in first class. Lila had faced men like Bradley before, real estate tycoons who built empires on the backs of displaced communities, who saw her skin color before her credentials. His name, Thornton Properties, was synonymous with controversial developments that raised neighborhoods for luxury condos. She'd clashed with his kind in community meetings and courtrooms, but this was personal. He'd tried to take something that was rightfully hers, and Lila wasn't about to yield. Across the aisle, Bradley leaned forward, his blue eyes narrowing as he muttered to his assistant, Claire Evans, who sat rigidly into C. Claire, her blonde hair pulled into a tight bun, clutched her oversized designer tote, her face pale as she nodded at Bradley's complaints. "This is absurd," Bradley said, loud enough for the cabin to hear. "Do you know how much I spend with this airline? Millions. And they let her sit there like she owns the place." His voice dripped with disdain. The word her spat like an insult. Claire whispered something inaudible, her eyes darting nervously toward Lila, but Bradley waved her off with a sharp gesture. "I'm not letting this go," he said, his tone low and seething. "They'll regret crossing me." Lila's grip on her pen tightened, but her expression remained serene. Her dark eyes focused on her notebook. She'd learned long ago to channel her anger into strategy, to let her actions speak louder than her emotions. Bradley's words stung, but they also fueled her resolve. This wasn't just about a seat, it was about respect, about the assumption that her place in the world could be negotiated because of who she was. She'd fought too hard to let that slide. The cabin door hissed open, and Sarah Mitchell, the flight supervisor, stepped into the first-class section. Her navy uniform was immaculate, her auburn hair neatly pinned, but her expression betrayed a flicker of unease beneath her practiced professionalism. Her name tag gleamed under the cabin lights, and her heels clicked softly as she approached row 2. "Mr. Thornton, Ms. Davis," she said, her voice calm but measured. "I understand there's been a misunderstanding about the seating. I'd like to resolve this quickly so we can proceed with departure." Bradley straightened, his posture commanding as he fixed Sarah with a hard stare. "There's no misunderstanding," he said, his voice cutting through the cabin. "I'm a Diamond Elite member. I always get to A. That seat was promised to me, and I expect you to fix this now." He gestured toward Lila, his gold watch catching the light. "She must have gotten a last-minute upgrade or something. People do that, don't they?" His tone implied that Lila's presence in first class was a fluke, an error to be corrected. Lila looked up, her gaze locking onto Bradley's with a quiet intensity that made him shift in his seat. "I booked this seat weeks ago," she said, her voice steady and clear, each word a deliberate counter to his assumptions. "I paid for it, just like you paid for yours. There's no mistake here." She paused, letting her words settle, then added, "If you have an issue with the airline system, take it up with them, not me." Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes flicking between Bradley and Lila. She'd been a flight supervisor for over a decade, trained to de-escalate conflicts and prioritize customer satisfaction. But this situation was a minefield. Bradley's Diamond Elite status carried weight as frequent. Flights and hefty spending made him a priority in the airline's eyes. But Lila's calm authority was unsettling, her presence commanding in a way that went beyond wealth or status. Sarah's tablet rested in her hand, its screen confirming Lila's booking. But the pressure of Bradley's expectations bore down on her like a physical weight. "Ms. Davis," Sarah began, her tone diplomatic but cautious, "I see that 2A is indeed your seat, and I apologize for any confusion. However, to keep things smooth for everyone, would you consider relocating to another first-class seat? We have 3A available, also by the window. It's just as comfortable, and it would allow us to accommodate Mr. Thornton's request." Her words were polite, but the subtext was clear. She was asking Lila to yield for the sake of peace, to prioritize Bradley's status over her own rights. Lila's pen paused, her eyes lifting to meet Sarah's. The cabin seemed to hold its breath, the other passengers' gazes heavy with curiosity. A woman in a silk blouse across the aisle lowered her magazine, her eyes wide. A businessman in a pinstripe suit tapped idly at his laptop, his attention clearly on the drama unfolding. Lila set her pen down, her movements deliberate, and leaned back in her seat, folding her arms. "Let me be clear," she said, her voice low but resonant, carrying the weight of years spent advocating for the voiceless. "I'm not moving. I paid for this seat. I chose it for a reason. And I'm not here to make things smooth for someone who thinks they're entitled to what's mine." Bradley's face flushed a deep red, his jaw clenching as he leaned forward. "Entitled?" he snapped, his voice rising, drawing every eye in the cabin. "You're the one being unreasonable. Do you have any idea who I am? I've built half of Chicago's skyline. I don't sit in aisle seats. I don't negotiate with—" He stopped short, his words catching as if he realized he'd ventured into dangerous territory. But the damage was done. The cabin's silence was deafening, the weight of his unfinished sentence hanging like a guillotine. Lila's expression didn't waver, but her eyes sharpened, pinning Bradley with a look that made him flinch. "With what?" she asked softly, her voice a blade wrapped in velvet. "Go on, Murdoch Thornton. Finish that thought." Her words were a challenge, daring him to expose the prejudice lurking beneath his polished veneer. Claire tugged at Bradley's sleeve, her voice a nervous whisper. "Bradley, maybe we should just sit down. This isn't worth—" "Quiet," Bradley hissed, cutting her off. He turned back to Lila, his voice low and venomous. "You're making a mistake. I always get what I want, and I'm not about to let someone like you ruin my flight." Lila tilted her head, a faint smile curving her lips, though her eyes remained steely. "Someone like me," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the force of a thunderclap. Interesting choice of words. She reached for her phone, her movements smooth and unhurried, and began typing a message. The faint chime of the phone confirmed it had been sent, and she set it back on her tray table, her calm demeanor unshaken. Only those who knew her well would have recognized the fire beneath her composure, the same fire that had dismantled corporate defenses in courtrooms and rallied communities against injustice. Sarah swallowed hard, her hands clasping her tablet tightly. She could feel the eyes of the cabin on her, the weight of expectation crushing her. Bradley's status demanded deference, but Lila's quiet authority was a force she hadn't anticipated. "Mr. Thornton," she said, her voice strained, "please take your seat for now. I'll need to consult with the captain to resolve this." She turned to Lila, her tone softer. "Ms. Davis, I'm sorry for the inconvenience. We'll sort this out." Bradley scoffed, his face a mask of barely contained rage. "You'd better," he muttered, sinking back into to be. His arms crossed tightly. "This airline will hear from my lawyers. Mark my words." Claire sank lower in her seat, her face pale, her tote bag clutched like a shield. The other passengers exchanged uneasy glances, their curiosity now tinged with discomfort. The woman in the silk blouse whispered something to her companion, her voice too low to catch. The businessman resumed typing, but his eyes kept drifting back to Lila. As Sarah retreated to the galley, Lila reopened her notebook, her pen resuming its steady rhythm. The message she'd sent had been to Marcus Reed, a former colleague now on the airline's board of directors. Marcus was sharp, loyal, and fiercely committed to fairness, a rare ally in a world of corporate games. Flight 392 to A. Diamond Elite member trying to displace me with biased remarks. Staff complicit. Handle it. The words had been brief but pointed, and Lila knew Marcus would act swiftly. She'd worked with him on a pro bono case years ago, exposing a corporation's discriminatory hiring practices. If anyone could cut through the airline's bureaucracy, it was him. Outside, the tarmac lights glimmered against the deepening twilight, the plane still stationary at the gate. The engine's hum grew louder, signaling the crew's preparations for departure. But Lila knew this delay was no coincidence. Bradley's arrogance had set something in motion, and she was ready to see it through. She glanced at her phone, its screen dark but pregnant with possibility. The storm was far from over, and Lila Davis was no stranger to weathering storms. The first-class cabin of Flight 392 was a pressure cooker, the air thick with unspoken judgments, and the faint hum of the Boeing 787's engines. Idling at the gate, the twilight sky outside the oval windows had deepened to a rich indigo, the tarmac lights flickering like distant stars against the Chicago skyline. Inside, the plush leather seats and polished wood paneling of the cabin stood in stark contrast to the simmering tension that gripped the passengers. The clink of champagne flutes had ceased, replaced by the rustle of magazines and the occasional whisper as eyes darted toward row 2. Lila Davis sat into A, her navy blazer crisp against the seat, her worn leather tablet case resting on her lap like a shield. Her notebook lay open, her pen poised over a page of handwritten strategies. But her dark eyes were sharp, tracking the movements of those around her. Across from her, into B, Bradley Thornton seethed, his silver hair glinting under the cabin's soft lighting as he leaned forward, his gold Rolex tapping rhythmically against the armrest. His assistant, Claire Evans, sat rigidly into C, her blonde bun taut, her designer tote clutched like a lifeline. The confrontation over Lila's window seat had escalated, and the cabin was now a stage for a battle of wills. Lila, a 34-year-old environmental lawyer and activist, was no stranger to high-stakes conflicts. Just days ago, she'd stood in a Chicago courtroom, her voice unwavering as she secured a landmark victory against a corporate giant polluting the South Side's water supply. The case had been a grueling marathon, months of late nights, hostile depositions, and the constant need to prove her worth in rooms where she was often the only black woman. Her win had brought cleaner water to thousands of families, earning her a front-page story in the Chicago Tribune and a flood of messages from grateful community members. But it had also left her exhausted, her spirit worn thin by the weight of being a beacon for others. This flight to Los Angeles, to her parents' home in Inglewood, was meant to be a moment of solace, a chance to recharge with her mom's cornbread and her sister Nia's infectious laughter. Yet Bradley Thornton's attempt to claim her seat had shattered that hope, exposing the same entitlement she'd fought against her entire career. Bradley's words still lingered in the air, sharp and deliberate. "I don't negotiate with." He'd stopped short, but the implication had been clear, a jab at Lila's presence in first class, at her very existence in a space he deemed his own. She'd heard it before, in boardrooms and community meetings, from men like Bradley, real estate tycoons who built empires on displaced neighborhoods, who saw her skin color before her credentials. Thornton Properties was infamous for its luxury developments that raised low-income communities, and Lila had clashed with his kind in courtrooms and protests. But this was different. This was personal. He'd tried to take something that was rightfully hers, and Lila's calm exterior masked a fire that burned hotter with every passing second. Sarah Mitchell, the flight supervisor, stood in the aisle, her navy uniform pristine, but her auburn hair slightly askew, betraying her unease. Her tablet rested in her hands, its screen confirming Lila's booking, but the weight of Bradley's Diamond Elite status pressed on her like a physical force. She'd been trained to prioritize high-value customers, to smooth over conflicts with diplomacy. But this situation was unraveling faster than she could manage. Bradley's voice, loud and indignant, had already drawn every eye in the cabin, and Lila's quiet refusal had shifted the dynamic in a way Sarah hadn't anticipated. Thornton, Sarah said, her voice strained but professional. I've confirmed that to A is Ms. Davis's seat. However, I'd like to explore all options to ensure everyone's comfortable. Ms. Davis, would you reconsider moving to 3A? It's still a window seat, and it would help us resolve this quickly. Lila set her pen down, her movements deliberate, and looked up at Sarah with a gaze that seemed to pierce through her. The cabin fell silent, the passenger's curiosity now a tangible weight. A woman in a silk blouse across the aisle lowered her magazine, her eyes wide with anticipation. A businessman in a pinstripe suit paused his typing, his fingers hovering over his laptop. Lila leaned back in her seat, folding her arms, her silk teal scarf catching the light. Ms. Mitchell, she said, her voice low but resonant, carrying the authority of someone who'd spent years advocating for the voiceless. This isn't about comfort, it's about fairness. I paid for this seat, I booked it weeks ago, and I'm not moving to accommodate someone who thinks their status trumps my rights. You're making a choice right now, and it's the wrong one. Sarah's lips parted, but no words came. She glanced at Bradley, whose face was now a deep shade of red. His jaw clenched as he leaned forward. This is outrageous, he snapped, his voice booming through the cabin, startling a passenger who dropped her glass, the ice clattering against the tray table. Do you know who I am? I'm Bradley Thornton. I own half of Chicago's skyline. I don't sit in all seats, and I certainly don't let people like her dictate my flight. His words were a venomous mix of arrogance and prejudice, the phrase people like her landing like a slap. Several passengers gasped, their whispers spreading like wildfire. The woman in the silk blouse shook her head, muttering something to her companion. The businessman's eyes narrowed, his expression shifting from curiosity to disapproval. Lila's expression remained serene, but her eyes sharpened, locking onto Bradley's with an intensity that made him shift uncomfortably. People like me, she repeated, her voice soft but cutting, each word a challenge. You keep saying that. Mr. Thornton, why don't you explain exactly what you mean? Her tone was calm, but it carried the weight of years of unspoken battles, of moments where she'd had to prove her worth against assumptions rooted in her skin color. Bradley's face twitched, his confidence faltering for a split second. He opened his mouth to respond, but Claire tugged at his sleeve, her voice a desperate whisper. Bradley, please, let's just sit down. This is getting out of hand. Her face was pale, her tote bag clutched tightly. But Bradley ignored her, his eyes blazing with defiance. I don't need to explain anything, he said, his voice low and menacing. You're the one causing a scene. You could have made this easy, but you chose to be difficult. Trust me, you'll regret this. Lila tilted her head, a faint smile curving her lips, though her eyes remained steely. I don't regret standing up for what's mine, she said, her voice steady, slicing through the tension. Like a blade, she reached for her phone, her movements smooth and unhurried, and checked the screen. A notification from Marcus Reed, her former colleague on the airline's board, flashed briefly. On it, corporate's been alerted. Stay calm. Lila's smile deepened, a private acknowledgement of the gears she'd set in motion. She'd sent Marcus a message in the first chapter, and his swift response confirmed that the situation was about to shift. Marcus was a bulldog when it came to fairness, and Lila trusted him to cut through the airline's bureaucracy like a knife. Sarah cleared her throat, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped her tablet. Let's all take a step back, she said, her voice wavering. Mr. Thornton, please remain in your seat. Ms. Davis, I apologize for the inconvenience. I'll need to consult with the captain to determine our next steps. She hesitated, her eyes lingering on Lila, as if searching for a way to diffuse the situation without alienating Bradley. But Lila's calm authority was a force she couldn't navigate. and Sarah's retreat to the galley felt like a surrender. Bradley leaned back in his seat, his arms crossed, his face a mask of barely contained rage. "This airline is a joke," he muttered, loud enough for the cabin to hear. "Letting someone like her call the shots. Unbelievable." His words were a deliberate jab, each one designed to provoke. But Lila didn't flinch. She reopened her notebook, her pen resuming its steady rhythm, as if Bradley's tantrum were no more significant than the hum of the engines. Her nonchalance only fueled his anger, his fingers tapping faster against the armrest, his Rolex glinting like a warning. Claire sank lower in her seat, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Bradley, maybe we should just let it go," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "This isn't worth the trouble." But Bradley shot her a withering look, silencing her. "Let it go," he hissed. "Do you know how much I've spent with this airline? I'm not letting some nobody make a fool of me." His voice carried across the cabin, drawing more whispers from the passengers. The woman in the silk blouse shook her head again, her companion nodding in agreement. The businessman closed his laptop, his eyes now openly fixed on the drama. Lila's phone buzzed softly. Another message from Marcus, corporate team dispatched. "Hold tight." She set the phone down, her expression unreadable, but a quiet fire burned in her chest. This wasn't just about a seat anymore, it was about respect, about dismantling the assumption that people like Bradley could bend the world to their will. She'd fought too hard, for too long, to let that stand. The cabin door hissed open, and a new figure stepped into the first-class section. The captain, a tall man in his late 40s with a crisp Navy uniform and a calm, authoritative presence, surveyed the scene. His name tag read Captain Daniel Hayes, and his gray eyes took in the tension with practiced neutrality. Sarah hurried to his side, her voice low as she briefed him. But the captain's gaze settled on Lila and Bradley, his expression giving nothing away. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice deep and steady, "I understand there's a seating issue. Let's resolve this calmly so we can get underway." Bradley straightened, his posture commanding as he fixed the captain with a hard stare. "Finally, someone with authority," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I'm Bradley Thornton, Diamond Elite member. That seat 2A was promised to me. I expect you to fix this immediately." He gestured toward Lila, his tone implying she was an obstacle to be removed. The captain turned to Lila, his eyes softening slightly. "And you, ma'am?" he asked, his voice respectful but firm. "What's your perspective?" Lila met his gaze, her voice steady and clear. "This is my seat, Captain. I booked it, I paid for it, and I'm not moving. If Mr. Thornton has an issue, it's with the airline, not me." Her words were simple but resolute, carrying the weight of someone who'd spent years fighting for what was right. The cabin held its breath, the passengers' eyes wide with anticipation. Bradley's face twisted in fury, but Lila's calm demeanor was unshaken. She knew the storm was far from over, but she was ready. The captain's arrival had shifted the dynamic, and with Marcus's intervention looming, the gears of justice were beginning to turn. The first-class cabin of Flight 392 was a crucible of tension, the air thick with the weight of unspoken challenges and the faint hum of the Boeing 787's engines. Idling at Chicago's O'Hare International Airport, the indigo twilight outside the oval windows cast a cool glow over the polished wood paneling and plush leather seats, but the warmth of the cabin's lighting did little to ease the storm brewing within. Passengers sat frozen, their champagne flutes untouched, their eyes darting toward row 2 where the battle over a single seat had escalated into something far greater. Lila Davis sat in 2A, her navy blazer crisp against the seat, her worn leather tablet case resting on her lap like a talisman. Her notebook lay open, but her dark eyes were sharp, tracking the movements of the captain who now stood in the aisle, his presence commanding the cabin's attention. Across from her, into B, Bradley Thornton leaned forward, his silver hair glinting under the lights, his gold Rolex tapping against the armrest in a rhythm of barely contained fury. His assistant, Claire Evans, sat rigidly into C, her blonde bun taut, her designer tote clutched tightly as if it could shield her from the escalating drama. Lila, a 34-year-old environmental lawyer and activist, was no stranger to standing her ground. Just days ago, she'd delivered a closing argument in a Chicago courtroom, securing a landmark victory against a corporate giant polluting the South Side's water supply. The win had brought cleaner water to thousands of families, earning her a front-page story in the Chicago Tribune and a flood of gratitude from communities long overlooked. But it had also drained her. The constant need to prove her worth in spaces where she was often the only black woman, taking its toll. This flight to Los Angeles, to her parents' home in Inglewood, was meant to be a moment of peace, a chance to reconnect with her mom's cornbread and her sister Nia's laughter. Yet Bradley Thornton's attempt to claim her seat had turned that hope into a battle, exposing the same entitlement she'd fought against her entire career. Bradley's words from moments ago still hung in the air, sharp and venomous. "I don't negotiate with people like her." The phrase, laced with prejudice, had sent a ripple of unease through the cabin, drawing whispers and disapproving glances from passengers. Lila had challenged him to clarify, her calm but piercing question, "People like me?" forcing him to falter. She'd seen men like Bradley before, real estate tycoons who built empires on displaced communities, who assumed her presence in first class was a mistake. Thornton Properties was notorious for its luxury developments that raised low-income neighborhoods, and Lila had faced his kind in courtrooms and protests. But this was personal. He'd tried to take what was rightfully hers, and Lila's quiet strength was a force he hadn't anticipated. Captain Daniel Hayes stood in the aisle, his navy uniform crisp, his gray eyes scanning the scene with practiced neutrality. His name tag gleamed under the cabin lights, and his deep, steady voice had silenced the murmurs when he'd addressed the cabin moments ago. "Ladies and gentlemen, I understand there's a seating issue," he repeated, his tone calm but firm. "Let's resolve this calmly so we can get underway." He turned to Bradley, who had launched into a tirade about his diamond elite status and the injustice of being denied his usual seat into A. Bradley's voice was loud, his gesture sharp, his gold watch catching the light with every wave of his hand. "I'm Bradley Thornton," he said, his tone dripping with arrogance. "I own half of Chicago's skyline. This seat was promised to me, and I expect you to fix this now." The captain listened patiently, his expression unreadable, his hands clasped behind his back. When Bradley finished, his face flushed with indignation, Captain Hayes turned to Lila, his eyes softening slightly. "Ms. Davis, what's your perspective?" he asked, his voice respectful. Inviting her to speak without pressure, Lila set her notebook down, her movements deliberate, and met the captain's gaze with a calm intensity that seemed to shift the cabin's atmosphere. "This is my seat, Captain," she said, her voice steady and clear, each word a testament to her resolve. "I booked it weeks ago, I paid for it, and I'm not moving. Mer. Thornton seems to think his status entitles him to what's mine, but this isn't about a seat anymore. It's about respect and the assumption that I don't belong here." Her words were measured, but they carried the weight of years spent fighting for justice, of moments where she'd had to prove her worth against prejudice. The cabin fell silent, the passengers' eyes wide with anticipation. A woman in a silk blouse across the aisle clutched her magazine, her companion whispering something inaudible. A businessman in a pinstripe suit closed his laptop, his gaze fixed on Lila, a flicker of respect in his eyes. Sarah Mitchell, the flight supervisor, stood behind the captain, her auburn hair slightly askew, her tablet clasped tightly. Her earlier attempt to persuade Lila to move had failed, and now she looked caught, her professional composure fraying under the weight of the situation. Bradley's face twisted in fury, his jaw clenching as he leaned forward. "Respect," he snapped, his voice booming through the cabin, startling a passenger who spilled her water, the ice clattering against the tray table. "You're the one being disrespectful. Do you have any idea who I am? I've spent millions with this airline. I don't sit in aisle seats, and I'm not about to let someone like you ruin my flight." His words were a deliberate jab, the phrase "someone like you" dripping with prejudice. Echoing his earlier remarks, the cabin erupted in whispers, the woman in the silk blouse shaking her head, the businessman's expression hardening. Lila's eyes sharpened, but her expression remained serene, her voice low and cutting. "You keep saying someone like me," she said, her tone a blade wrapped in velvet. "But you haven't answered my question. Thornton, what exactly do you mean by that? Her challenge hung in the air, daring him to expose the bias beneath his polished veneer. The passengers leaned forward, their curiosity now tinged with discomfort, as if they sensed the confrontation was about to tip into uncharted territory. Bradley's face twitched, his confidence faltering for a moment. He opened his mouth to respond, but Claire tugged at his sleeve, her voice a desperate whisper. "Bradley, please, this is getting out of control. Just sit down." Her face was pale, her tote bag clutched tightly, but Bradley ignored her, his eyes blazing with defiance. "I don't owe you an explanation," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You're the one causing a problem. You could have made this easy, but you chose to be difficult. Trust me, this will have consequences." Lila tilted her head, a faint smile curving her lips, though her eyes remained steely. "Consequences?" she repeated, her voice soft but resonant. "I'm not the one who needs to worry about those." She reached for her phone, her movements smooth and unhurried, and checked the screen. A new message from Marcus Reed, her former colleague on the Airline's board. Flashed briefly, corporate team en route. "Stay the course." Lila's smile deepened, a private acknowledgement of the storm she'd set in motion. She'd contacted Marcus in the first chapter, and his swift response confirmed that the airline's higher-ups were already involved. Marcus was a fierce advocate for fairness, and Lila trusted him to ensure this incident wouldn't be swept under the rug. Captain Hayes raised a hand, his voice cutting through the tension. "That's enough," he said, his tone firm but calm. "Mr. Thornton, I've reviewed the seating assignments. Seat 2A belongs to Ms. Davis. It was booked and paid for in advance. Our policies are clear. Status doesn't override a confirmed reservation." His gray eyes locked onto Bradley, his authority unmistakable. "I must ask you to remain in your assigned seat so we can proceed with departure." Bradley's face turned a deeper shade of red, his jaw working furiously. "This is unacceptable," he hissed, his voice rising again. "Do you know who I am? I'm a Diamond Elite member. I've flown with this airline for decades. You're telling me you're siding with her over me?" He jabbed a finger toward Lila, his gold watch glinting under the lights. "This is how you treat your most loyal customers." The captain's expression didn't waver, his voice steady. "I'm siding with policy, Thornton, and I'm siding with fairness. If you continue to disrupt the cabin, I'll have no choice but to remove you from this flight." His words were a quiet thunderclap, sending a ripple of murmurs through the passengers. The woman in the silk blouse gasped, her companion nodding in approval. The businessman's lips curved into a faint smile, his respect for the captain evident. Sarah shifted uncomfortably, her tablet clasped tightly, her eyes darting between the captain and Bradley. She'd hoped to resolve the situation diplomatically, but the captain's intervention had raised the stakes. She glanced at Lila, whose calm demeanor was both inspiring and unsettling. Lila's words, "This isn't about a seat anymore. It's about respect," echoed in her mind, forcing Sarah to confront her own role in the situation. Had she been too quick to prioritize Bradley's status? The thought gnawed at her, her professional confidence crumbling under the weight of doubt. Bradley leaned back in his seat, his arms crossed, his face a mask of barely contained rage. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice low but audible. "You'll hear from my lawyers. And you," he glared at Lila, his eyes blazing, "you'll regret crossing me." His threat hung in the air, heavy with malice, but Lila didn't flinch. She reopened her notebook, her pen resuming its steady rhythm, as if Bradley's words were no more significant than the hum of the engines. Claire sank lower in her seat, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Bradley, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "This is going too far." But Bradley ignored her, his fingers tapping faster against the armrest, his Rolex glinting like a warning. The passengers exchanged uneasy glances, their whispers growing louder. The woman in the silk blouse leaned toward her companion, muttering, "He's out of line." The businessman resumed typing, but his eyes kept drifting back to Lila, a flicker of admiration in his gaze. Lila glanced at her phone, the screen still dark but pregnant with possibility. Marcus's message had confirmed that corporate was on the way, and she knew the situation was about to shift. She'd fought too hard, for too long, to let Bradley's arrogance go unchecked. This wasn't just about a seat, it was about dismantling the assumption that people like him could bend the world to their will. She leaned back in her seat, her silk teal scarf catching the light, her calm exterior masking the fire within. The cabin door hissed open, and two figures in sharp suits stepped into the first-class section. Their presence was immediate, commanding, their expressions unreadable. One carried a sleek briefcase, the other a tablet, their polished shoes clicking against the cabin floor. Sarah's face paled, her tablet slipping slightly in her hands. The captain turned, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if he'd been expecting their rival. The passengers held their breath, sensing the shift in the air. Lila's lips curved into the faintest smile, her eyes never leaving her notebook. The gears of justice were turning, and she was ready to see them grind. The first-class cabin of Flight 392 was a tableau of held breaths, the air charged with anticipation as the Boeing 787 sat motionless. At Chicago's O'Hare International Airport, the indigo twilight outside the oval windows had deepened into a starless night, the tarmac lights casting a faint glow over the polished wood paneling and plush leather seats within. The hum of the engines was a steady undercurrent, but it couldn't drown out the tension that gripped the passengers. Their eyes were fixed on row 2, where Lila Davis sat in 2A, her navy blazer crisp, her worn leather tablet case resting on her lap like a badge of resolve. Her notebook lay open, but her dark eyes were sharp, tracking the two corporate representatives who had just stepped into the cabin, their sharp suits and unreadable expressions commanding immediate attention. Across from her, into B, Bradley Thornton sat rigid, his silver hair glinting under the cabin's soft lighting, his gold Rolex still against the armrest for the first time. His assistant, Claire Evans, into C, clutched her designer tote, her blonde bun taut, her face pale with dread. The battle over Lila's window seat had reached a boiling point, and the cabin was now a stage for justice to unfold. Lila, a 34-year-old environmental lawyer and activist, had faced countless battles, but this one felt personal. Days ago, she'd secured a landmark victory in a Chicago courtroom, forcing a corporate giant to clean up the South Side's polluted water supply. The win had brought hope to thousands of families, earning her a front-page story in the Chicago Tribune, but it had also exhausted her. The constant need to prove her worth as a black woman in hostile spaces taking its toll. This flight to Los Angeles, to her parents' home in Inglewood, was meant to be a reprieve, a chance to savor her mom's cornbread and her sister Nia's laughter. But Bradley Thornton's attempt to claim her seat, laced with prejudiced remarks like "someone like you," had turned it into a fight for respect. Lila had stood her ground, her calm defiance a force that had rattled Bradley and exposed the flight crew's complicity. The corporate representatives stood in the aisle, their presence a stark contrast to the cabin's earlier chaos. The taller of the two, a man with close-cropped hair and a sleek briefcase, held up an ID badge, his voice low but commanding. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, addressing Sarah, the flight supervisor, who stood nearby, her auburn hair askew, her tablet clutched tightly. "We're with corporate. We need to speak with you and your team immediately." His colleague, a woman with a sharp bob and a tablet in hand, scanned the cabin, her eyes lingering on Lila for a moment before settling on Bradley. Sarah's face paled, her hands trembling as she nodded. "Yes, of course," she stammered, gesturing toward the galley. "This way." Bradley leaned forward, his voice sharp with indignation. "What's this about?" he demanded, his gold watch catching the light as he gestured. "I'm a Diamond Elite member. If anyone should be talking to corporate, it's me. This woman," he jabbed a finger toward Lila, "is the one causing trouble." His words were a desperate attempt to reclaim control, but they fell flat, the cabin's silence heavy with judgment. Passengers exchanged glances, their whispers muted but pointed. The woman in a silk blouse across the aisle shook her head, muttering to her companion, "He's digging his own grave." The businessman in a pinstripe suit closed his laptop, his eyes fixed on the corporate team, a flicker of anticipation in his gaze. Lila remained serene, her notebook open, her pen poised. She'd contacted Marcus Reed, her former colleague on the Airline's board, in the first chapter, and his swift response had brought these representatives to the cabin. Marcus was a bulldog for fairness, and Lila trusted him to ensure this incident wouldn't be buried. Her message to him had been clear: Flight 392 to a Diamond Elite member trying to displace me with biased remarks. Staff complicit. Now, as the corporate team took charge, she felt a quiet satisfaction, the fire in her chest burning steady, but controlled. The taller representative turned to Bradley, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Thornton, we've reviewed passenger testimonies and corporate records," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Your behavior has been deemed disruptive and inconsistent with our code of conduct. Multiple witnesses have reported biased remarks, including phrases like 'someone like her,' directed at Ms. Davis." He paused, letting the words sink in, as Bradley's face flushed a deep red, his jaw clenching. "As a result, your Diamond Elite status is revoked, effective immediately. We must also ask you to disembark the aircraft." The cabin erupted in a collective gasp, the passengers' whispers swelling into a low hum. Bradley's eyes widened, his voice rising in disbelief. "You can't be serious," he shouted, leaping to his feet, his gold watch glinting as he gestured wildly. "Do you know who I am? I've spent millions with this airline. You're throwing me off for her." His finger jabbed toward Lila again, but his words lacked the confidence of before, his arrogance crumbling under the weight of the corporate team's authority. Lila looked up, her gaze steady, her voice soft but piercing. "This isn't about me, Mr. Thornton," she said, her words carrying across the cabin. "It's about accountability. You assumed you could take what wasn't yours because of who you think you are, but the world doesn't bend to your will anymore." Her tone was calm, but it held the weight of years spent fighting for justice, of moments where she'd had to prove her worth against prejudice. The passengers leaned forward, their eyes wide, some nodding in silent agreement. The woman in the silk blouse clapped softly, her companion smiling. The businessman's lips curved into a faint grin, his respect for Lila evident. The female representative stepped forward, her tablet glowing with data. "Ms. Davis, we've also reviewed the crew's handling of this situation," she said, her voice professional but warm. "We apologize for the unacceptable treatment you received. The airline is taking immediate steps to address this, including disciplinary action for those involved." She glanced at Sarah, who looked as if the floor had dropped out from under her, her tablet slipping in her hands. Jason, the young flight attendant who'd initially sided with Bradley, stood in the galley, his face pale, his hands clasped nervously. Sarah swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ms. Davis, I'm so sorry," she said, her eyes meeting Lila's for the first time with genuine remorse. "I should have handled this differently." Her admission hung in the air, a small but significant acknowledgement of her role in the situation. Lila nodded, her expression softening slightly, but she didn't respond. Her focus was on the bigger picture, ensuring this incident sparked change. Beyond the cabin, the taller representative turned back to Bradley, his voice firm. "Mr. Thornton, security is waiting outside to escort you off the plane. We suggest you comply to avoid further escalation." His words were a final blow, leaving no room for argument. Bradley's face twisted in fury, his hands trembling as he grabbed his briefcase from the overhead. "Ben, this is outrageous," he shouted, his voice echoing through the cabin. "You'll hear from my lawyers. This airline is finished." But his threats felt hollow, his once commanding presence reduced to a tantrum. Claire stood, her face flushed with embarrassment, and followed him, her tote bag clutched tightly, her eyes avoiding Lila's. As security appeared at the cabin door, their uniforms crisp, Bradley stormed down the aisle, his protests growing fainter with each step. The door hissed shut behind him, the sound a sharp punctuation to the tension that had gripped the cabin. The passengers erupted in murmurs, some clapping softly, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The woman in the silk blouse turned to her companion, saying, "He had it coming." The businessman reopened his laptop, but his eyes lingered on Lila, a quiet respect in his gaze. Lila leaned back in her seat, her notebook still open, her pen resting on the page. She allowed herself a small, satisfied smile, her calm exterior masking the fire within. This wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. about ensuring that no one else would face what she had. She glanced at her phone, where a new message from Marcus flashed, handled. CEO's ordering a full review. You're a force, Lila. Her smile deepened, a private acknowledgement of the change she'd set in motion. The corporate representatives approached her seat, the taller one inclining his head respectfully. Ms. Davis, on behalf of the airline, we extend our deepest apologies, he said, his voice sincere. We're implementing new protocols to prevent this from happening again, and we'd like to offer you complimentary first-class travel for the next 2 years as a gesture of goodwill. Lila met his gaze, her expression unreadable. I appreciate the gesture, she said, her voice steady, but what I want is accountability not just for me, but for every passenger who's been made to feel less than because of who they are. I trust you'll follow through on that review. Her words were a challenge, a reminder that her fight extended beyond this cabin. The representative nodded, his respect evident. You have my word, he said, stepping back. Sarah lingered in the aisle, her face etched with guilt. Ms. Davis, I'll do better, she said. Her voice trembling. Lila nodded, her expression softening. I hope so, she said simply. Returning to her notebook, the cabin settled into a reverent hush, the passengers' eyes lingering on Lila, as if recognizing they'd witnessed something profound. The engines roared to life, signaling the plane's imminent departure. Outside, the tarmac lights faded into the distance, the night sky stretching endlessly above. Lila glanced out the window, her silk teal scarf catching the light, her heart steady. The storm had passed, but its ripples would be felt far beyond this flight. She'd stood her ground, and in doing so, she'd changed the course of the day and perhaps the airline itself. The first-class cabin of Flight 392 had settled into a reverent hush, the tension that once crackled like static now replaced by a quiet awe. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner had finally pushed back from the gate. At Chicago's O'Hare International Airport, its engines roaring to life as it taxied toward the runway, bound for Los Angeles. The night sky outside the oval windows was a deep velvet, punctuated by the distant glow of tarmac lights fading into the darkness. Inside, the cabin's plush leather seats and polished wood paneling gleamed under the soft lighting. But the atmosphere was transformed. Passengers sat upright, their champagne flutes gently clinking as they stole glances at row 2, where Lila Davis sat into her navy blazer crisp, her worn leather tablet case resting on her lap. Her notebook lay open, but her dark eyes gazed out the window, reflecting the starless night. The seat beside her, to be, was empty. Bradley Thornton's absence a stark reminder of the justice that had unfolded moments ago. Into C, Claire Evans sat slumped, her blonde bun loosened, her designer tote discarded at her feet, her face etched with shame. Lila, a 34-year-old environmental lawyer and activist, felt a quiet satisfaction settle in her chest, like the calm after a storm. Days ago, she'd stood in a Chicago courtroom, her voice steady as she secured a landmark victory against a corporate giant, polluting the South Side's water supply. The wind had brought cleaner water to thousands of families, earning her a front-page story in the Chicago Tribune and a flood of gratitude from communities long ignored. But it had also left her weary, the constant need to prove her worth as a black woman in hostile spaces weighing heavily. This flight to Los Angeles, to her parents' modest home in Inglewood, was meant to be a moment of solace, a chance to savor her mom's cornbread and her sister Nia's infectious laughter. Yet Bradley Thornton's attempt to claim her seat, laced with prejudiced remarks, like someone like you, had turned it into a battle for respect. Lila had stood her ground, her calm defiance dismantling his arrogance and exposing the flight crew's complicity. Now, with Bradley removed and corporate intervention secured, she felt the weight of her victory not just for herself, but for every passenger who'd ever been made to feel less than. The cabin was alive with murmurs, the passengers' eyes lingering on Lila with a mix of admiration and curiosity. The woman in a silk blouse across the aisle leaned toward her companion, her voice low but clear. She didn't just win a seat, she showed him what real power looks like, she said, her companion nodding in agreement. The businessman in a pinstripe suit reopened his laptop, but his gaze kept drifting to Lila, a quiet respect in his eyes. The earlier chaos, Bradley's threats, his prejudiced outbursts, the crew's hesitation had faded, replaced by a collective recognition of what had transpired. Lila had turned a personal slight into a stand for justice, and the cabin felt different because of it. Sarah Mitchell, the flight supervisor, stood in the galley, her auburn hair still askew, her navy uniform slightly crumpled. Her tablet rested on the counter, its screen dark, as if she couldn't bear to look at it. She'd apologized to Lila moments ago, her voice trembling with guilt. I should have handled this differently. The admission had been a small but significant step, a crack in the armor of her professional detachment. Sarah had been trained to prioritize high-value customers like Bradley, to smooth over conflicts with diplomacy. But Lila's calm authority had forced her to confront her own biases. Had she been too quick to side with status over fairness? The question gnawed at her, her hands trembling as she poured a glass of water. Her reflection in the galley's stainless steel surface, revealing a woman grappling with her own shortcomings. Jason, the young flight attendant who'd initially deferred to Bradley, approached Lila's seat, his brown hair neatly combed but his eyes heavy with remorse. "Ms. Davis," he said, his voice soft, almost hesitant, "I owe you an apology. I didn't handle this right. I got caught up in his status, and I should have stood up for you from the start." His hands clasped nervously, his name tag glinting under the cabin lights. Lila looked up, her expression softening, her silk teal scarf catching the light. "Thank you, Jason," she said, her voice steady but kind. "It's not just about me. It's about doing better for everyone who comes after me." Her words were a gentle challenge, a reminder that accountability was a shared responsibility. Jason nodded, his face flushed with gratitude and resolve, and returned to the galley, his steps lighter, but his heart heavy with lessons learned. Claire, in to sea, was a shadow of her earlier self. She'd followed Bradley's lead without question, nodding at his complaints, but his removal had left her exposed, her loyalty to him now a source of shame. She glanced at Lila, her eyes brimming with unshed tears, but she couldn't bring herself to speak. Her tote bag, once a symbol of her status as Bradley's assistant, lay discarded, its designer logo meaningless in the wake of his downfall. She fumbled with her phone, her fingers trembling as she typed a message, perhaps to Bradley or to someone else, her face a mask of regret. Lila noticed but said nothing, her focus returning to her notebook, her pen resuming its steady rhythm. Claire's reckoning was her own to face. The corporate representatives had left the cabin after their decisive intervention, but their words lingered. "We're implementing new protocols to prevent this from happening again." Lila had challenged them to go further, to ensure accountability for every passenger, and their promise to follow through was a start. She glanced at her phone, where a final message from Marcus Reed, her former colleague on the airline's board, glowed. "CEOs on board. Full diversity training mandated. You've sparked a fire, Lila." Her lips curved into a faint smile, a private acknowledgement of the change she'd set in motion. Marcus had always been a fierce ally, and his swift action had turned her stand into something bigger, a catalyst for systemic reform. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, steady and authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Daniel Hayes. We're cleared for takeoff and expect a smooth flight to Los Angeles. Thank you for your patience." The passengers settled into their seats, the cabin's atmosphere lighter, as if the plane's ascent would carry them away from the conflict that had defined the past hour. Lila leaned back, her notebook open, her eyes drifting to the window, the runway lights blurred as the plane gained speed, the night sky stretching endlessly above. She thought of her family in Inglewood, her mom's warm hugs, her dad's quiet pride, Nia's endless questions about her cases. This victory wasn't just for her, it was for them. For every person who'd ever been told they didn't belong. The woman in the silk blouse caught Lila's eye and offered a small nod, a gesture of solidarity. "You were incredible," she said, her voice soft but sincere. "Thank you for standing up." Lila smiled, her expression warm but reserved. "It's what we do," she said simply, her words carrying the weight of a lifetime spent fighting for justice. The businessman across the aisle glanced up from his laptop, his eyes meeting hers for a moment, a silent acknowledgement of her strength. The cabin felt like a community now, bound by the shared experience of witnessing something profound. As the plane lifted off, the cabin tilted gently, the lights of Chicago fading into the distance. Lila's heart was steady, her spirit buoyed by the knowledge that her stand had changed the course of the day she'd faced. Bradley's arrogance, the crew's complicity, and the weight of prejudice. And she'd emerged not just victorious, but transformative. The flight to Los Angeles was no longer just a journey home. It was a testament to the power of standing firm, of demanding respect, of sparking change. She closed her notebook, her pen resting on the page, and allowed herself a moment of peace. The dawn was coming, and Lila was ready to meet it. The Los Angeles skyline glittered below as Flight 392 descended into LAX. The city's lights a mosaic of hope against the inky night. The first-class cabin of the Boeing 787 Dreamliner was quiet, the hum of the engines a gentle reminder of the journey that had unfolded over the past few hours. The plush leather seats and polished wood paneling glowed under the soft cabin lights, but the atmosphere was one of reverence, as if the passengers carried the weight of a shared transformation. Lila Davis sat into her navy blazer slightly rumpled from the long flight, her worn leather tablet case tucked beside her. Her notebook lay closed on the tray table, its pages filled with strategies for her next environmental justice project. Her silk teal scarf caught the light, a quiet symbol of her strength. The empty seat in to be, once occupied by Bradley Thornton, was a testament to the battle she'd won not just for a seat, but for respect. And to see, Claire Evans sat silently, her blonde bun undone, her designer tote forgotten, her eyes fixed on the floor as if searching for answers in the cabin's carpet. Lila, a 34-year-old environmental lawyer and activist, felt a deep calm settle over her, like the stillness of a lake after a storm. Days earlier, she'd stood in a Chicago courtroom, her voice unwavering as she secured a landmark victory against a corporate giant, polluting the South Side's water supply. The win had brought cleaner water to thousands of families, earning her a front-page story in the Chicago Tribune and a wave of gratitude from communities long overlooked. But it had also drained her, the constant need to prove her worth as a black woman in hostile spaces leaving her weary. The flight to Los Angeles, to her parents' modest home in Inglewood, was meant to be a moment of respite, a chance to savor her mom's cornbread and her sister Nia's laughter. Yet Bradley Thornton's attempt to claim her seat, laced with prejudiced remarks like "someone like you," had turned it into a fight for dignity. Lila had stood her ground, her calm defiance dismantling his arrogance, exposing the flight crew's complicity, and sparking a corporate reckoning that had changed the course of the day. Weeks had passed since that fateful flight, and the ripples of Lila's stand were still spreading. The airline had issued a public apology, splashed across news outlets and social media, acknowledging the unacceptable treatment of a passenger and announcing sweeping reforms. Mandatory diversity and inclusion training was now required for all employees, from flight attendants to executives, with a focus on confronting unconscious bias. A new passenger rights policy had been implemented, ensuring that no one's status Diamond Elite or otherwise could override a confirmed booking. The Chicago Tribune ran a follow-up story, titled "One Woman's Stand Sparks Airline Overhaul," detailing Lila's role in the changes. Social media buzzed with hashtags like #RespectForAll and #Lila Davis, turning her story into a rallying cry for justice. Commenters praised her courage, sharing their own experiences of prejudice, while others called for more industries to follow suit. Lila hadn't sought the spotlight, but she welcomed it, knowing her story could inspire others to demand respect. In Inglewood, Lila sat at her parents' dining table, the smell of cornbread and collard greens filling the air. Her mom, a retired school teacher with a warm smile, squeezed her hand, her eyes shining with pride. "You did good, baby," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Not just for you, but for all of us." Her dad, a quiet man who'd worked decades as a mechanic, nodded, his calloused hand resting on hers. "You showed them what we're made of," he said, his rare words carrying the weight of a lifetime. Nia, Lila's younger sister, a college student with a knack for social media, grinned across the table. "You're trending, sis. People are calling you a hero." Lila laughed, shaking her head. But the warmth of her family grounded her, reminding her why she fought. This was home, where her strength had been forged, where every victory was shared. Back in Chicago, Bradley Thornton's empire was crumbling. The public fallout from his behavior on Flight 392 had been swift and merciless. News outlets ran exposes on Thornton properties, highlighting its history of displacing low-income communities for luxury developments. Clients distanced themselves, contracts were canceled, and his once untouchable reputation lay in tatters. Social media posts mocked his meltdown, with memes of his gold Rolex and phrases like "I own half of Chicago" going viral. Bradley had retreated from the public eye, his threats of lawsuits silenced by the overwhelming evidence of his prejudice. Claire Evans, his former assistant, had resigned, her LinkedIn profile now listing a new job at a nonprofit, a quiet attempt to rebuild her life after the shame of that day. Lila didn't dwell on their downfall. She'd never sought revenge, only accountability. But the knowledge that Bradley's actions had consequences was a quiet vindication. Lila's phone buzzed with a message from Marcus Reed, her former colleague on the Airline's board. "Just got word, diversity training's rolling out. Nationwide, CEOs calling it the Davis Protocol. You've left a mark, Lila." She smiled, her heart swelling with pride. Marcus had been her ally from the start, his swift action turning her stand into a catalyst for change. The Davis Protocol wasn't just a policy, it was a legacy, a reminder that one person's courage could reshape systems. She typed a quick reply, "Thanks, Marcus, let's keep pushing." Her next fight was already brewing, a new environmental justice case in Chicago, targeting a factory polluting a predominantly black neighborhood. The call had come yesterday, and Lila was ready, her notebook already filling with strategies. The passengers from Flight 392 had carried Lila's story with them. The woman in the silk blouse, a marketing executive, had shared it at a conference, urging her colleagues to confront bias in their workplaces. The businessman in the pinstripe suit, a venture capitalist, had donated to a community organization in Chicago's South Side, inspired by Lila's work. Even Sarah Mitchell, the flight supervisor, had changed. She'd enrolled in additional diversity training, determined to lead by example. Her apology to Lila, a turning point in her career. Jason, the young flight attendant, had written Lila a letter, thanking her for showing him the importance of standing up for what's right. The cabin had been a microcosm of the world, and Lila's stand had touched every corner of it. As Lila walked through LAX after landing, the memory of the flight lingered. The captain's steady voice, the corporate team's decisive action, the passengers' nods of respect. They were all part of a moment that had transcended a single seat. She'd boarded the plane seeking peace, but had found purpose instead. Now, back in Chicago, she stood at her office window, the city's skyline a reminder of the battles she'd fought and those yet to come. Her silk teal scarf was draped over her chair, a quiet symbol of her resilience. She thought of Bradley's empty seat, of the airline's reforms, of the voices now amplified because she'd refused to yield. This wasn't just her victory, it was a call to action, a reminder that respect is not a privilege, but a right. The narrator's voice, warm and resonant, closed the story. Lila Davis didn't just claim a seat, she claimed her place in the world. And in doing so, she reminded us all, respect is not a gift to be given, but a necessity to be demanded. So stand up, speak out, and let your voice be heard. The world is listening.